And so thank you everybody for joining Jesse and I. I'm personally excited about this conversation because if you've ever listened to any of the other webinars that I've participated in from a high trust perspective where we talk about AI, it's typically high level and we kind of go over just what the assessments are, and we talk philosophically about getting started as soon as possible, how important AI security is. Whereas this conversation, we're going to go down a level two, and make it, I don't want to say technical, but more operational from a AI security perspective and how it works with high trust. And Jesse's my subject matter expert here. And I'm going to pass it to him here in a second to introduce himself. But I want to encourage the audience to be engaged. And when I say that, I want you to comment or add questions in the chat in real time, because depending on what we're talking about, we may pick that question up immediately and answer it on the fly. So this is not slide heavy at all. I will warn you, there is a handful of slides, but this is definitely more conversational, and we want you all to be a part of that conversation and get your questions answered, or you know any comments that you may have about terrible air travel or what have you. So, Jesse, I will turn it over to you to introduce yourself, please.
Yeah, hi, Jesse Goodale. I work for LBMC. I'm a senior manager there. I work with all things high trust. Prior to LBMC, I was with Big Four Consulting, and before that, I started my career in property and casualty insurance internal audit. So I've always had quite the exciting fields.
Yeah, yeah, I can relate. So my background is primarily healthcare, cybersecurity consulting, and being in the military. So never a dull moment. All right, so Jesse, I think we probably need to set the stage a little bit about just what high trust has within the AI space, whether it be AI security or AI risk management. You want to take us through what that looks like, and then we can get a little bit deeper.
Yep, absolutely. So I think there's a slide that goes along with this. It's probably one of the 3 or 4 slides that we have. So essentially there are, here we go. Yay. All right. Awesome. Essentially there are 2 high trust offerings that we have. The first one is what we call an AI risk management assessment. That's going to be more around risk management and data governance. It's delivered as an insights report and not a certification. So that means that you're just going to get an idea of how you stack against the framework, and not necessarily a piece of paper that you can hand to someone and say, hey, I'm certified here. As I mentioned, it's all around risk management. The key point here, though, is that it does need to be bolted on to some kind of high trust certification. And Ryan, I believe you've talked about this a little bit more. The concept here is that you need to be able to have some core controls around the environment that aren't just AI focused. So encryption, identity and access management, and then, of course, all of the supporting organizational controls that are needed. Key point here is this first one is kind of almost an insights report. Now, the second sort of report is actually a certification. Adds 44 requirements. It can be added to an E1, an I1, or an R2. Those requirements are tested just like you would test them, for the validated assessment itself. And then out of that, you get a separate dedicated certification, assuming that you pass. And that certification is scored separately from the main certification. So it allows you to get the same level of robustness, but if you don't pass one, you could potentially pass the other still. And a key strategy here with either offering is that you can either bolt this onto your existing validated assessment, or you could have a standalone. And with something like this, you would want to take into consideration the level of robustness of the supporting controls that you're able to kind of stand up in that AI environment. I know a lot of organizations are going for standardized controls and good practices across the organization. That's a great opportunity to demonstrate to your stakeholders that your AI environment has the same level of robustness as any other environment that's HITRUST certified. There are other organizations where the AI environment is less mature, and so then therefore you would want to go with something like an E1 or an I1 to more quickly stand up and demonstrate that you do have some good AI specific controls, and then also you're applying basic cyber hygiene to that environment.
Yeah, the only thing I would add here is that the high trust perspective on AI security is you can't have a quote unquote secure AI system unless the underlying infrastructure is also hardened adequately. So that's why the underlying assessment, whether it be an E1, I1, or an R2, for either one of these options, is in some cases required to be a part of the assessment or an option, is because we believe that foundational security is actually super critical to the overall system being secure. So, Jesse, we got two different assurance types, two different assessment types. When should an organization begin their journey to pursue one or both?
All right, that's a great question. You know, the answer tends to always be early. Often, it's much easier to build security into fresh infrastructure, a fresh model, a fresh application. Um, you know, it's always easier to do alongside a pilot. And what that'll do is that'll allow you to start with secure controls and get the groups familiar with those organizational controls that they need to adhere to. And then what that'll do is that's typically more efficient than if you do it later on in the game. Now, from a commercial perspective, we do understand that some of these models don't actually see the light of day. And some of these models don't apply to products that clients might not want HITRUST for. So we do have clients that, even though they recognize the value of HITRUST, they also understand that this might not be something they need right now. So, it's the same common conversation that we always have. Great to start early and start those controls on a good foot. But at the same time, if you're never going to have the demand for you to prove out that assurance, then you really need to consider holding off at those early stages. Um, where we're seeing a lot of integration of HITRUST with AI is kind of in that mid-stage development portion. You have business processes. AI might be running in the live environment. It might be making or helping you make decisions. Your risk exposure is now a live risk exposure because it is providing input. Assurance becomes more critical for governance as well as stakeholder confidence. Again, it's not just a pilot; it's something that you're using in the live environment. And then finally, the most difficult option is when you have to deploy HITRUST for mature AI operation. So this is when your AI functionality kind of reaches scale. It's mature. It's part of your core business processes or a product. And at that point, it almost becomes probably some kind of regulatory concern as well. So really three stages that you get into, with the first stage being the easiest and probably the last stage being the most labor intensive, just because you have to kind of redeploy some controls or think about how your environment needs to change.
Yeah, and what I've been talking to folks about is as early on in the AI system development process, ideally at the design phase, before you've actually built anything, that's where you should be considering the security and the underlying controls and how they're going to be implemented prior to even coding a single thing. So to Jesse's point, if you do it if you do it at the design phase, life will be a little bit easier. Whereas if you are already at deployments or implementation, it's going to be a lot harder. You're playing catch up big time. And this actually is not something new. I think we've learned this 10, 20 years worth of software development, that it's a lot easier to build secure code up front than have to secure code after the fact. So I guess that's my parting takeaway on that topic. All right, Jesse.
Yeah, and I one more comment on that. I think it's a different game with AI too, because you have the data scientists and you have the product team. So you might be building an infrastructure that a model gets bolted onto. The product team is understands how AI works, or I'm sorry, development works, etc. But that data science team may have never touched a control before. They're used to just going through data sets, and a lot of those data sets aren't as controlled because there's a lot more collaboration. So it can sometimes be a cultural shift depending on where the thinking part of the model is going.
Yeah, and I guess that leads us to a question of what are the triggers to get started, right? We talked about these different stages that you could get started. Can you talk us through like what the triggers are to decide at which stage you should get started?
Yeah, I think the earliest that you can identify a clear trigger is if something new is being introduced into the environment. If it gets labeled as AI per your organization, the second that AI starts to be developed or potentially launches, that's when you need to take it into consideration. As we just discussed, it might not be the right time because that launch might not be a full launch, or in part of the organization that you might be scoping in covered information. A lot of different reasons we've already discussed. Second big trigger is some kind of risk function has identified a potential new risk because of introducing AI. So this could be internal audit, the board, operational risk. That's a good time because then it's on their minds. You can oftentimes harmonize efforts between internal and external assessments to get a better understanding of where we sit in terms of security. The biggest one, as we discussed too, is customer or partner demand for AI governance. This is probably the largest HITRUST trigger in general, is when you have some of your external stakeholders saying, hey, how do I know this is working securely? How do I know my data is being safe? So that's probably the largest trigger. And then finally, the hardest point to kind of integrate this, but also probably the most mandatory, is if you feel that regulatory changes or regulatory introductions will occur because of this AI.
Which is super relevant right now. There's a ton of conversation going at both the state and federal level, and even internationally, around AI and, in some cases, safe harbor for AI developments or requirements for AI development. So I think that only reinforces your point, Jesse, that, I don't think you should wait. And where it makes sense or where it's doable, then you should start to tackle this. And that leads me to my next question for you, Jesse, is we talked about the triggers, like these are things that could be a cause for you to take the plunge, so to speak. But is there a good timing? Is there a good time to get started? Is there specific events that would um, cause you to take a look and start this journey?
Yeah, that's a great question. So I think the first thing that we should think about is how AI development is a little bit different from standard product development, right? Standard product development, you're both using Agile or DevOps or something like that at this point, but you have kind of your minimum viable product, you have your UAT, you have your go live date, and as long as those are met to the standards expected, like that's kind of the day that you really start worrying about things. But with AI, because of the fact that it's constantly learning, it's constantly being updated, you have to take a different approach to when you need to start to think about implementing, high trust assurance or additional controls. So, our first recommendation here is to make sure that you're aligning with your business cycles and how that AI function is actually working. So, it could be something like, product development sprints or release cycles. It could be with your standard annual compliance reviews. It could be a milestone that you set based on the pervasiveness or use of some of this tooling. So I think it becomes a bigger consideration than it normally does, and I think it becomes a sliding scale as that functionality is added, as more tools and modules and different parts of that AI ecosystem are added. You're going to have to continue to reconsider where assurance activities need to start, and where you can start to formally assess. With that said, there are some common timing pitfalls. I think the first one, as we mentioned, waiting too long. You don't want to wait until AI is fully deployed. Any updates at that point become very costly, especially if you don't have those good governance controls, because then you have, all of these models with these complex workflows, and the workflows themselves may not be, change managed correctly, or we might not have the security between different modules within the workflow. So I would say that's a big one. Secondly, is misjudging the complexity of AI. We think of AI as a prompt and then a big black box in the background, but there are actually many, many steps that happen in between. Those steps typically are the ones that are being developed in-house. So those are the ones that we're kind of thinking about the most. And those are the ones that we can provide the most assurance and ensure the most controls sit. So understanding that it's going to take you some time, especially if you are someone that's more controls focused than, a data scientist or, advanced level developer. And then the other thing, because AI is so complex and has so many different parts, typically organizations rely on a lot of different departments to kind of handle things. You've got your infrastructure team, you might have SecOps, you might have, a data science team. And so the more teams that you incorporate, the more difficult it is to make change within the organization. So you need to continue to rely on higher and higher levels of executive management to kind of help you drive change where it's needed. So if you're slow to adopt, especially internally, it's going to be more challenging just to get the right level of buy-in, that you can get budget and resources and just the willingness to make changes.
Okay, we've kind of set some good groundwork here, and I think it's time to get a little deeper. So, as a what I like to call a recovering external assessor for HITRUST, which he's not recovering, he's still an external assessor for HITRUST. I would stress to my customers about the need and the importance of scoping. I would spend a considerable amount of time with them to scope the assessment, because it's really easy to overscope and it's really easy to underscope a high trust assessment, generally speaking. And I think some of that applies within the AI security space. So, Jesse, what considerations, whether it be what should be included in scope versus what should be excluded from scope, like what are some of the considerations that you would share?
There are many considerations, and I'm also at the same time going to go through some fictitious models here. I used AI to create these models, so they may or may not be realistic, but they're at least something to go off. That's not any of my client information, right? So high level, the first thing is we need to make sure that everything that we're assessing from a high trust perspective is in-house. If we're leveraging public tools or different tools, those that aren't ours, those have to be either assessed at that entity, or we have to scope those out because we don't have control over the governance and security controls. Second is, client controlled data sources. So, if models are pulling in data sets that don't belong to us or that we don't have stewardship over, we can't assess those. Another one is, any kind of client run AI lifecycle management. So that's your change management, development, deployment, monitoring. All of that can be assessed. Um, Organizational controls, policies, procedures. So we kind of talked about um, the fact that we have to start with at least an E1 cyber hygiene assessment to bolt those AI assessments onto. That's where these organizational controls come in. So we still need to be able to follow policies, roles, accountability structures. By the same token, um, non-AI systems, unless directly supporting AI functionality, we don't want to include those systems in the AI specific baseline. So they'll still get HITRUST assessed like they are standard, but they'll be excluded from the AI specific assessments. The next one is experimental models not yet tied to business outcomes. Um, this goes back to, it's great to start early, but if you're starting too early where there are no business outcomes, there's no tangible use, we want to avoid those models until we can say, hey, this is something that we have demand for, we're piloting it, potentially we're using live data. That's where we need to start having that conversation. And then lastly, third-party AI tools without sufficient visibility or control. So similarly, like with the models, if there's any tooling that goes along with it, that's a third party's ownership, we need to exclude that or separately assess it or use the inheritance program if available. Now, looking at these three examples here, we came up with a rule-based real-time financial fraud detection application here. So as you can see in this model, the vast majority of the model can be assessed from a HITRUST perspective, right? So the incoming transaction feeds, any behavioral analytics, rule engine, any governance, any context engines that we're developing, and any monitoring and alerting queues that we're also developing. Now, the blue and white dotted line box, those are all the boxes that we can't really assess from a HITRUST perspective. So in this example, it's location signals from external devices. So this is like if you're using your cell phone to make bank transactions. Similarly, the device fingerprinting. And then on the other end, we were talking about the example where devices that are not devices, but components of the organization that don't have AI inbuilt into it. So like as an example, you would have a case management system after all of the AI is run. That's part of your operational applications. So those aren't necessarily covered, through an AI assessment. You would just use your standard HITRUST assessment. Can we go to the next slide, please? Yeah, the middle slide. Yeah, there we go. So the next one is a predictive AI system. And so for that one, similarly, there's going to be a lot that you can really assess here. This is a hospital readmission risk predictive AI system. So this is essentially identifying high-risk patients that have been released from a hospital that might wind up back in the hospital, and how can we support them and get them the additional care that they need. So similarly, you might have an identity and access management like an Entra external to the system itself. So that can't really be assessed for a couple different reasons. And similarly, external APIs that are being pulled in, that it's being configured and controlled by another part of the organization or potentially even another organization. But the remainder of the system that can be assessed, assuming that it's being developed and maintained in-house. And then finally, that fourth slide. This is a generative AI system. So on the back of this is a large language model, and that's probably the largest chunk of the whole model itself or the whole system itself. That's typically third party and potentially open sourced. So we can't provide any assurance around that because we have no ownership or governance around that. And then also there's typically a vector database that kind of links the internally developed model with that large language model, and provides a little bit of transparency to the model around what's happening on the back end. Other than that, everything that you're tweaking in house, that can be assessed right up until we get to the point where we have the input channel. So this is what we're calling user channels here. So it's essentially any external source of data that's not part of the data development and model enhancement.
So Jesse, when you said you used AI to develop these graphics, it reminded me of when I first started using ChatGPT. I told it that it was called Skynet, and I asked when it would become self-aware, and I think I broke it because it didn't actually give me the answer I wanted. So I feel like there's a dichotomy there that you used AI to talk about securing AI. But I think it's important to point out that we talked about the two assessments that HITRUST has today: the AI risk management assessment, which is built off of kind of a harmonization of two different standards, the NIST AI RMF and then ISO 23894. And that is a risk management focused assessment, meaning it's more high level and it's around how you're managing the risk of the system itself and less about the hardening and the security of the system. So the AI security cert is, as we've articulated, looking at actual security controls and the implementation of them. And then Jesse's team will come in and determine whether they're implemented effectively and they're scaled across the system appropriately, the maturity of those controls, so on and so forth. So they look at AI from two different perspectives. One's more high level, it's more process oriented and program oriented, and then you have something that's a little more tactical and technical, and they don't apply in all cases. And Jesse has alluded to this and said this a bit in this conversation. The AI security certification really is only for AI implementers and deployers, those people who are developing AI systems. You cannot use, Jesse's team cannot assess an AI model and for it to achieve an AI certification if you have purchased it from another developer, implementer, deployer, whatever, because you don't own the management of those controls. And I'll use a very cliche example. Everybody's got, if you're a Windows shop, you've got Microsoft Copilot, you've probably got a bunch of other Microsoft AI tools. You're a consumer of those tools. It's up to Microsoft to harden those tools and secure those tools. So Microsoft would be the one that would get the AI security cert. What you could do in that case as a consumer is do the AI risk management, right? Because you would be able to apply those risk management principles to all of the systems that you are a consumer of. So I just want to point that out because I don't want people to walk away from this conversation thinking that they need to go and secure, I don't know, what Gemini or what have you, because that's up to Google. Hardening and securing Azure Copilot is up to Microsoft. So wanted to throw that out there. Let's, Jesse, now that I'm off my soapbox, let's talk about best practices for scoping.
Yeah, and Ryan, that's a really great point that you brought up because, in thinking about best practices for scoping, I have a lot of clients right now that are saying, well, we're at this point where we're noodling, right? Like we have a large language model that we're buying or renting off the shelf. Right now, it's just chatting with our customers to help with customer service workflows, or helping with scheduling or something like that. So that's a great time to bring in that risk management framework because even if it's an off the shelf model, you'll still be able to start to get and scope in that good governance. Whereas if you try to do the same thing with a security assessment, you probably wouldn't have anything to scope in because there's nothing really that you can assess on your own. So, with all of that said, uh, the first thing that I would think about is starting with business goals, right? What's driving the assessment? Who is asking for assurance? It's very similar to just getting that high trust assessment in general. Ryan, you've said it before. This AI assessment, either one, is a great way to prove to external stakeholders that you're starting or continuing your assurance journey with AI. So that's definitely the big first one. The second one is using a modular approach, right? Like if we try to boil the ocean, it's going to be a lot more difficult, especially considering that certain parts of the organization, certain models, certain products, certain functionalities might not have the same business goals. So we need to start with what we feel is the most critical function, of AI or department or use case or what have you. Once we do that, we definitely need to engage in cross-functional teams. So as I mentioned, uh, IT is going to act like a shared service for your data scientists and your AI developers. So right away, you've got two teams that you need to get involved, and similarly, legal and compliance can potentially get involved as well, depending on the nature of data. So it's always good to get as many stakeholders as you think necessary. Especially considering that you need to pass at least an E1 within the AI environment. Also, it's important to document your own assumptions. You're going to be dealing with people with very different skills from your own. You're potentially a compliance minded person, a risk minded person. They're data scientists. They don't know much about risk. We don't know as much as they do about AI. It's important that you understand what the boundaries and exclusions of the scope could be, and that you're articulating it to other people for feedback, because those experts are going to be able to help you. They might use a different language, but you'll be able to get there if you start to document the assumptions and understand where the edges of your scope are. With that said, there are some common scoping pitfalls to avoid. The first one is overscoping. As I mentioned, you want to start with the most critical AI components first. Anything that's in R&D might not be a priority for you right now. Other workflows that they're just trying things out and it might not have a business case, again, hold off on those. Another that we've sort of already discussed is underscoping. This is missing critical dependencies, or not appreciating the level of complexity that the AI model might have. And then finally, as we mentioned, making sure that you're properly documenting your assumptions. So this is making sure that you're avoiding any like vague scope definitions. This will lead to misalignment with all the stakeholders. I think all of that said, this leads us to some common conclusions here. You want to start early and start small. Just like they're piloting AI, you can also pilot AI assurance. So start with your high impact use cases. You want to scope with intentions. As we kind of mentioned, making sure that you're aligning with, the business value, the risk exposure, your stakeholder expectations, potentially client expectations. Um, Use high trust offerings as a roadmap. As Ryan mentioned, there are two very distinct offerings that high trust has. One is essentially good practice risk management, can be started very early in the process. The other one, you potentially could want to start that later just because you don't have a mature environment that's aligned to business outcomes. And then also, high trust is a maturity model. It's meant to be a strategic enabler. So we want to make sure we're thinking long term and not just checkbox auditing. This will become really, really critical.
Yeah, I guess I want to take it one step further, Jesse. And admittedly, I'm going off script a little bit here, so I apologize if I put you on the
Mhm.
spot. So we've talked about scoping, we've talked about pitfalls, we've talked about use cases. When you look at the actual testing of the system during the audit itself, like what does that look like? Is it eerily similar to what you would experience for a traditional high trust security certification? Are there special considerations? Any thoughts that you can share based on the work that you're doing now?
Okay, I'm going to pivot on that question a little bit because there is something that is eerily common amongst a lot of my clients that are going down this AI journey. Um, it's around documented and understood roles and responsibilities. I'm finding with a lot of my clients that where they need the most help with is it's not understanding what a good control environment looks like, what good controls look like. They're often very talented developers and data scientists. It's knowing who needs to keep an eye on what, who's responsible for data stewardship, who's responsible for ensuring secure connections, who's responsible for configuration of the environment, and then the other part of that is getting the organizational level controls like training, like records retention and data classification, all of those other controls. We're often finding that everybody that we bring to the table understands what those controls look like, but no one's made a decision about who's responsible for that. So that's, I know I'm not directly answering your question. I think that's the biggest point out of what I'm seeing in commonality is it's not actually looking at the technical controls. It's figuring out eventually who will be responsible for those. And then once you get to the point where everyone's aligned, you have your data stewards, then it looks like a very typical high trust audit. It's just getting screenshots, it's going through lists, it's looking at data, it's reconciling things. It's very standard once you get over those hurdles.
Yeah, that actually doesn't surprise me that there's. I'm going to say this, and it's going to come out, somewhat negative, but there's a lack of accountability and responsibility because based on what I'm seeing and hearing from folks, people are kind of intimidated and overwhelmed by the explosion of AI in the last 2 or 3 years since Gen AI came out. So everybody's scrambling to just try to wrap their arms around it, and they're not doing it in a normal, within the existing programs or processes that they have that they would do for any type of technology because people don't understand AI like we were able to understand the cloud. The adoption has accelerated way faster than cloud adoption did, but it's eerily similar. So I'm not necessarily surprised to hear that there's role definition gaps, as you would say. All right, another off script question, and then I think we're going to jump into some Q&A here. So we've talked about one side of the coin, which is, hey, I have this AI system, or I am a consumer of an AI system. What about from the other side of the equation, where you're purchasing some kind of system, or you're embedding an existing model into something that you're doing? Think about it through the lens of third-party risk management, which is a pet project for me. What considerations are there for folks who are more focused on the procurement of AI systems that they should be thinking about?
Yeah, that's a great question. And, shameless plug here. Ideally, it would just be high trust certified, right? And I think because, high trust is one of the only certifications that you can get for, AI specific systems. It's pretty much the only game in town and a huge advantage to have that. Outside of that, there's a modicum of transparency that needs to happen, right? To your point, you need to go through, just like we would go through an E1, I1, or R2, underneath the AI assessment. We'd want to do the same thing with the organizations that we're doing business with, right? So you'd want to go through that standard sniff test process, the standard third-party assurance controls. Are they financially stable? Can they provide certain pieces of information? Do they have good governance in place? Are they willing to cooperate? Do they have a good track record, references, things like that? So that for me is table stakes. Um, Beyond that is, and it's very difficult to articulate without using specific examples, but you need to think about how their systems should be architectured and what kind of assurance of controls they're offering, right? Because if depending on what the model looks like and what the model's doing, you know, they might be able to say, okay, well, we have an ingestion point here. This is where we use your data. This is what it's actually doing. These are the expected outcomes. It might be in more detail or less detail depending on, specifically what that model's doing, but you should have those standard expectations that they know how things work. They know generally what's happening to the data. They know where the data resides. They know it's secure, and they're willing to provide that information. Also, you need to think about how you're interacting with that model too. Is it their tenant? Is it your tenant? What kind of controls can you put in place? Is it single sign-on? What's the identity and access management around the system? So there are a lot of considerations, and all of these are just examples I'm kind of rattling off at this point. But you need to use the same common judgment that you'd use with any vendor, and then just make sure you're not falling into a trap where they're saying, okay, all of this goes into a black box and I really don't have a good answer for you outside of that. Because the reality is, yes, there are some unknowns, but there are a lot of things that you can do to mitigate what's happening outside of those unknowns.
So if I'm hearing you correctly, you're recommending for organizations to leverage their current TPRM processes and programs to evaluate the inherent risk of the model, and then obviously um, gain some level of assurance that the model is being managed appropriately. So don't try to catch up later on. Do it during the onboarding or procurement as you're purchasing these systems, kind of moving forward. Now, if you've already bought a bunch, and there is going to be some catch up you have to play with there. Think about how the contracts are written. Think about building collaborative relationships with these vendors, if you will, these third parties, but don't overthink it. Utilize the processes that you have in place today. Is that safe?
Right. And it should be a simple leverage of, your subject matter specialists within the organization that are working with this AI function to work with, your common infrastructures, whether it be IT or organizational, to give the additional knowledge and say these are the additional things you should be looking on aside from a standard vendor, because of the nature of AI. It should be a collaborative approach, and there should be a level of transparency from the organization selling the product to you.
Yeah. Another question just came into my head before we get to the audience questions. Shadow AI. Real, fake, dangerous, safe? Thoughts?
Yeah, that's a good one. It's like any other shadow anything, shadow IT. It's going to become more pervasive too as some of these AI products become more of commodities, right? Because right now, uh, you know, everybody sometimes struggles with talking to the machine, asking a simple question, you get this weird answer. So right now, you kind of need those data scientists incorporated into the workflow to kind of help you translate, your business function into AI. As AI becomes better, it's going to be a lot simpler for someone in healthcare ops or finance, another part of the organization, to pluck something off the shelf and then start to use it with the rest of the our organization, not realizing what's happening on in the background. So I would say it's a real thing, and it's probably only going to get worse unless we start to think about our AI governance models early on in the process.
Okay. Yeah, I agree with you. I think, I often quote a McKinsey report that came out in 2023, so obviously a few years ago, that globally, I think it was 78% of organizations have AI already. And if you think about how AI is being embedded into tools that they probably already consuming, that number is probably way higher. And the folks internal to your organization are probably using their own instances of something like ChatGPT. So getting your arms around that, I think, is pretty critical to managing the risk of that. So threw a question out to the audience in the chat. Should we do a webinar on shadow AI, and we can kind of talk through what we're seeing and what we recommend is put in place, whether it be from a policy perspective or training or what have you. Is that a topic that people would be interested in? So if you can answer the question in the chat, I would appreciate it. All right, let's get to some audience questions, Jesse. So the first question that came in is, for using AI tools in development, is it recommended to implement the HITRUST AI risk management controls or the AI security controls, or both in parallel? I have some thoughts, but I'm going to turn it over to you.
Yeah, so there's a logical series of steps to take. Especially if your organization is new to AI and you're doing something very heavily in house, the risk management is a great place to start because you don't need tangible AI that's deployed in a live environment where you're also evaluating a lot of security controls. So I would say that would be the good starting place. If you have something that's already in place, and there's a this, and I'm thinking like almost like a mid mature organization, right? Something's in place, they're using it, their customers are using it, it's making decisions, but maybe there's only like one thing. So for that, I would say that's a great place to have the security assessment first, because you need to make sure that that particular operating AI environment is secure. And then later on, to add to the maturity in that specific scenario, you'd almost want to go back and then do the risk management as well. So as you govern that particular model and think about other models or other functions or other AI environments, you're now building it out in advance as opposed to going back and just testing the security controls.
Yeah, that's pretty much in line with what I was thinking. One important consideration is the HITRUST only certifies implemented or deployed production systems. So if it's still in development, you may not be able to get it certified at that point, but that doesn't mean you can't take the AI security controls into the deployment environment and start to leverage those controls to harden the system while it's still in development. And then once it goes into production, then you can bring Jesse in and he'll test and validate and we'll certify it. So ideally, you would do both, but I understand in practicality, that's typically not something that most organizations can bite off at the same time. If you can, absolutely build that overarching risk management governance structure and test and validate the security controls if possible. If not, then follow Jesse's advice. Okay. Next one is, as a consumer of an AI product, when should you be asking for an assurance? So I think this goes back to our comments around third-party risk management. Any additional thoughts, Jesse?
Yeah, I think we've covered most of this. At the end of the day, if you are consuming, an AI product and that AI product is, um, ingesting some of your potentially PHI, PII covered information, you should start to be asking for, some kind of assurance around that. Whether it be ISO or HITRUST or something, some kind of framework where they're at least starting to think about those security controls. Um, It'll be a risk management decision on your part, as to how much risk you're willing to take, as a lot of organizations are still kind of working through what the controls look like and how do they provide assurance to third parties. HITRUST is certainly one of them, but as we were just discussing, it is kind of a journey, so it is going to take some organizations some time, and you'll have to kind of risk manage that, as you're making your considerations.
Okay. Well, awesome. I think that is the last question. Um, shout out or a call to action. If there's any questions burning in your mind, get them in right now. But while we see if anybody has anything else, Jesse, any closing thoughts or comments?
Uh, Thanks everyone for your time. And yeah, I think that Shadow IT webinar is a really good idea. Or
Oh, sweet!
Shadow AI.
I had a good idea. All
Yeah.
right, let's write this down. Let's document for historical purposes. Sweet. Okay. Well, thanks everybody. As I mentioned, I was pretty excited about this conversation. Jesse, you did a great job. I think your insights are great because you're kind of at the front lines. You're at the bleeding edge of this AI security journey and the work that you're doing with your current customers. So, thanks everybody. If you have any questions that come to your mind after we close out here, you will get our contact information as a follow up to this. Do not hesitate to reach out to us, and you can find Jesse and I talking and thinking about AI security and other topics on LinkedIn at any time. So feel free to connect with us. Thanks again.